Hi, welcome to At the Movies with AMC. I am John Spurney, and we're talking about Westerns. We're looking at American films through the lens of genre, and the genre we're talking about is the Western. Last week, we looked at Stagecoach, which is kind of a classic example of the Western genre. Today, we're looking at a modern retake on that genre, and the film is Unforgiven from 1992, directed by Clint Eastwood, released by Warner Brothers. So in discussing Stagecoach, we talked about how the golden age of the Western in the United States was roughly from 1940 to 1960. And as we said, it was so popular in the 1950s that the number of Western films produced by the major Hollywood studios outnumbered all other genres combined. It was a very, very popular genre. But by the 1960s, the Western had fallen out of favor in the United States. And when the Western started to reappear in the 1970s, it did so as a much, much darker genre. And much like what we saw when we looked at Chinatown's reassessment of the film noir genre in the 1970s, the pessimism about America's participation in the Vietnam War and the fallout from the Watergate scandal that had enveloped the administration of President Richard Nixon caused Hollywood filmmakers and really all artists in America to look at traditional genres with a much more jaundiced eye. And this was particularly true of the Western because the Western was so representative of a particularly idealized and mythologized view of American history. And thus it seemed particularly in need of reassessment in light of the political and social upheavals of the 1960s and 70s. So films of this era, not just Westerns, but really most films of this era are not about the triumph of the system. They are about the corruption inherent in the system. And so Unforgiven is a particularly extreme example of this reassessment. So much so, Westerns of this period are often called revisionist Westerns. And Unforgiven is a revisionist Western. But so much so that it's not so much a revisionist Western, but really rather typifies a new genre that came to be known as the anti-Western. And so as the name suggests, the anti-Western is more than just a reassessment of the genre. It's a subversion of it. It's literally turning it on its side. And as we discussed when we talked about Stagecoach, the traditional Western features strong white protagonists, good guys on the right side of the law, like sheriffs and cowboys. So the anti-Western subverts this. Often the protagonists of these films are outlaws or Native Americans, and both of those people usually are the villains in a traditional Western. They become the protagonists in the anti-Western. And similarly, the traditional Western features male protagonists. You know, women are generally ancillary to the main action. And in most Westerns, women serve only as caregivers or objects of sexual desire. But the stories in the anti-Western often feature strong female characters, and these characters are often essential to the film's action. Traditional Westerns feature a good guy versus a bad guy. And we talked about this in the struggle of civilization versus the wilderness. But the anti-Western is morally ambiguous. There is no clearly defined good guy or bad guy. And the struggle isn't between good and evil, but the struggle is really one of survival within the context of this moral ambiguity in a world where the lines between good and evil really no longer exist. So Unforgiven is kind of a perfect example of the anti-Western. You know, there are no good guys in this movie. The protagonist, you know, the hero, for lack of a better word, Bill Money, William Money, played by Clint Eastwood, is an outlaw and a murderer who admits to cold-bloodedly killing men, women, and children in his past. He is not a good guy. He's also, unlike the protagonists of the classic Western, he is not heroic. You know, in Stagecoach, we see this glamorous dolly shot the first time we see John Wayne. But the first time we see Eastwood, he's literally falling in the mud trying to corral his hogs. He can't shoot. You know, we see that he's unable to shoot. And there are constant shots of his inability to mount a horse. You know, he is not a hero. He's the absolute opposite of the powerful Western hero. He's not a gunslinger or a cowboy. He's just a struggling farmer trying to take care of his livestock. And in the classic Western, the sheriff is the good guy, you know, the instigator of justice and civilization in the Wild West. But Little Bill, the sheriff in Unforgiven, played by Gene Hackman, is really the villain of the movie. He's the baddest of all the bad guys in the movie. So the sheriff is a bad guy, which is a complete, you know, turnaround from the traditional Western. So even though Eastwood's character Money is an outlaw, in true anti-Western style, he is the protagonist of the movie. He is an anti-hero. And initially, you know, we support him because we know that he truly loved his wife. He's trying to raise his children all alone. We know that his hogs are sick and he needs money. We know that the men he's trying to kill slashed Delilah's face and got away without punishment. So his goal of killing them seems to have a moral component. And of course, he's played by Clint Eastwood, a movie star who had portrayed the hero in countless Westerns before this film. So, you know, we do support him. But, you know, after his friend Ned, played by Morgan Freeman, has been killed, Money basically turns back into a monster and once again becomes the infamous cold-blooded killer we've all heard about. And, you know, at the end of the picture, he kills virtually everyone in the saloon in the climax without any qualms whatsoever. You know, he's just killing people left and right. And, you know, this reversion from good guy to bad guy in the film is really symbolized by his drinking of whiskey. So, you know, for the entire movie, he's blamed his previous bad behavior on being drunk, and he's avoided drinking. But, you know, when this woman comes out and tells him that Ned has been killed, you know, once he hears that news, he starts drinking again. And that this act of him drinking is symbolic of the switch to evil. And then we see when he's approaching the saloon, he drops the bottle. It's completely empty. And so we know that he has, you know, drunk the entire bottle. And that is really symbolic of, you know, the minute he starts drinking again, he reverts to his old ways. And any status he had as the good guy in the movie completely disappears. So Money may be the hero of the movie, but by the film's end, he has become as bad as everybody else. And in fact, the movie goes to great lengths, I think, to show us that Money and Little Bill, the sheriff, are essentially the same in their lack of morality, even to the point where the characters have the same name. You know, Eastwood's character is William Money, but Ned and the kid both call him Bill. He's referred to as Bill by lots of characters. And Hackman's character is Little Bill. And, you know, usually when you write a screenplay, you go, in fact, it's kind of an unwritten law of screenplay writing that no characters in a movie should have names that even start with the same letter, because that can be confusing to audiences. So the fact that David Webb Peoples, who wrote this great script, chose to name both characters, give them the same name, I think is heavily symbolic, you know. And in the climactic scene at the end of the movie, when Money's about to kill Little Bill, we get this exchange.
I'll see you in hell, William Money. Yeah.
I love that. He just says, yes, I will see you in hell. We will both be in hell. We are equally evil. He knows he is just as evil as the man he is about to kill. So throughout the movie, we really see Money go through a total reversion. We watch a man who has been trying to be good and struggling with it turn into an evil drunk obsessed with revenge. It happens before our eyes. And of course, this is a complete reversal of the classic Western plot where the protagonist triumphs over evil in the end. Rather than triumphing over evil, in this film, the protagonist succumbs to it. The protagonist becomes evil. So another way in which Unforgiven is an anti-Western is, as we discussed earlier, the importance of women in the story. Traditional Westerns revolve around men. And obviously the protagonists of this film are men. But Unforgiven is a story driven really by women. The incident that incites the plot is the slashing of Delilah's face and the efforts of her fellow sex workers to put together a bounty so that they might achieve revenge. And even more so, we said that the common thematic trope throughout the sort of classical Western genre is the conflict between wilderness and civilization. And throughout Unforgiven, women are the civilizing force. It's the women that keep the men from exercising their negative urges. Not just in the instance we already described where Delilah's fellow sex workers pool their money to achieve justice for the assault on her. But also, Money is constantly talking about how his wife saved him from his life as an outlaw by curbing his drinking. We see the sort of civilizing power, I think, in the look on Ned's wife. This shot as they leave of her face when Money comes to convince Ned to join him in the murder. And Money even refers to this look as the evil eye, but her disapproval is so obvious. And I think throughout the movie, the women always have the moral high ground. The men are terrible, and the women are trying to create a just society. And so I think in contrast, to the women's efforts to build civilization, we see the failure of men to create civilization in the symbolism of Little Bill's house. And this is kind of a running thing that goes through the movie. And I think the house is really a symbol of civilization. People are trying to build a civilization in the wilderness. The house is an attempt to impose a physical structure on the wild landscape of the West. And throughout the film, we see Little Bill trying to construct this house and thus, trying to impose some sense of order on the wilderness around him. But the construction is faulty. Here's the symbolism. And he ultimately fails, symbolizing the failure to impose a sense of civilization onto the wilderness. So the first time we see him working on the house, he hits his thumb with a hammer. We hear later the deputies discussing how poorly the house is constructed. And when the writer Beauchamp comes to the house during the rainstorm, we can see that the roof is full of holes. Water is constantly leaking into the interior of the house. And finally, when Money's about to kill Little Bill in the saloon, they have this exchange.
I don't deserve this. To die like this. I was building a house. Deserves got nothing to do with it.
And so it's a strange thing to say, right? When you're about to be murdered. I was building a house, but symbolically, it means a lot. His failure to finish the house is a symbol of the failure of the men in the picture to successfully impose any sense of justice or order on their surroundings. And I think the house, the house is his inability to build the house is kind of played for laughs, but I think it's sort of symbolically an important part of the movie. Still, another way that Unforgiven is an anti-Western is that it specifically calls attention to the falsity of the mythology of Western heroism. And that mythology forms the basis of the classic Western genre, but it is constantly refuted here. Nearly every character's reputation in the movie is just based on hearsay, which we eventually learn is false. And this is most pronounced in the character of English Bob, played by Richard Harris. And just kind of an interesting story, when Eastwood started working on the picture, he knew he wanted Richard Harris to play English Bob. And so he called him to ask him to be in the movie. And just through some incredible coincidence, English Bob was watching a Clint Eastwood movie on television, High Plains Drifter, when the phone rang. And so he's watching an Eastwood movie, the phone rings, he picks up the phone, and a voice says, "Hi, it's Clint Eastwood." And he thought it was a joke. He thought someone was pranking him. Obviously, they worked it out, and he's in the picture. And he's important because he is the prime example of the falsity of the Western myth. He's accompanied by the writer Beauchamp, who in this frame is on the left-hand side. And Beauchamp has written a book, The Duke of Death, which Little Bill mistakenly calls The Duck of Death. And that book tells of Bill's supposedly heroic exploits as a gunslinger. But when English Bob is in jail, Beauchamp learns from Little Bill that all of Bob's stories are false. And I think the character of English Bob really only exists in the film to reinforce this theme of falsity. He's really completely inconsequential to the rest of the plot of the movie, but he does make this point that a lot of the legends that we think about when we think about the Old West are not true. And there are other examples of this falsity. It's not just him. Through the picture. So, for example, Money is told terrible things about how badly Delilah has supposedly been disfigured, including mutilation of her body. And of course, all those things turn out not to be true. The Schofield kid claims to be a great shot, and he claims to have killed 5 men. But it turns out he's almost blind and can barely shoot. And after he murders the second of the 2 bountied cowboys, he admits that he'd never killed a man before. He hadn't killed 5 men. He'd killed none. It was a lie. And so through the course of the story, we see that, the legends of the West, which form the complete basis of the earlier classic films of the Western genre, are all based on lies. And that is a big part of the anti-Western. And similarly, this film constantly deglamorizes violence generally, and the act of murder specifically, which in the classic Western, those things are shown as easy and almost noble actions. But in Unforgiven, there is no nobility in murder. And really interestingly, unlike any classic Western, most of the characters in the movie cannot bring themselves to kill someone. And I think it's because they have a knowledge of the real life implications of killing someone, which in the classic Western, villains and Indians are dispatched with, no hesitation whatsoever. But in the universe of Unforgiven, people know what happens when you kill someone. And Money even says this himself to the kid after the kid has committed his first murder.
It's a hell of a thing, killing a man. You take away all he's got and all he's ever gonna have.
And so, Little Bill gives Beauchamp his gun in the jail and tells him if he can shoot him, Beauchamp and English Bob can escape. But Beauchamp is unable to pull the trigger. He can't do it. And then Beauchamp gives the gun to English Bob in the cell. And right there. And Bob is unable to pull the trigger as well. And then when Ned wounds the first bounty cowboy, not only is he unable to finish the job and actually kill him, he can't do it, so he gives the gun to Money. But he quits and decides he wants to go home without completing the job, And this is a far, far cry from the classic Western, where gunfights and murder without hesitation are just constant thematic tropes. And interestingly, when murders are carried out in Unforgiven, they are completely unheroic and unglamorous. In this sequence, Money kills the first bountied cowboy while he's wounded and crying for help. He's just like lying on the ground, completely helpless. And then, when the Schofield Kid kills the second bountied cowboy, he kills the guy while he's using the toilet. There is absolutely nothing heroic about these acts. And again, it's a far cry from the exciting and glamorous way that killings are usually portrayed in classic Western films. So I think we've seen in many, many ways Unforgiven embodies the major traits of the anti-Western. It's a film full of moral ambiguity, where even the supposedly good guys turn out to be just as bad as the bad guys at the end. And it's very interesting that it was directed by Clint Eastwood, because Eastwood had a career where he basically moved from making traditional Westerns as an actor to making anti-Westerns as an actor and a director. He started as an actor. His career breakout was actually on a television show, the very popular Rawhide. And he was on that show from 1959 to 1965. There he is, young and handsome. Even though it was a television show, Rawhide was a very traditional Western and followed all the classic tropes of the Western genre. But as a result of his success in Rawhide, Eastwood got cast as a character who was only referred to as the man with no name in A Fistful of Dollars, which is a 1964 Western directed by Sergio Leone. Leone was an Italian director, and the success of A Fistful of Dollars led to a whole new genre of films referred to as spaghetti Westerns, because they were films about the American West, but they were shot by Italian directors. Leone was Italian, and usually he shot them in Spain. So Eastwood would go on to make 2 more films playing the same character for Leone, for A Few Dollars More in 1965 and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in 1966. And these 3 films collectively are now known as the Dollars Trilogy, and they were incredibly influential films, especially on Quentin Tarantino, who constantly cites them as a major influence on his work, especially Django Unchained, which is basically an homage to the spaghetti Western. And the character that of the man with no name that Eastwood played in the Dollars Trilogy was the beginning of Eastwood's personal move into the world of the revisionist and the anti-Western. And in these films, that character is morally ambiguous, and he is a far, far cry from the unabashed good guy that Eastwood had played in Rawhide. So eventually Eastwood started to direct. He directed his first film, that's the Dollars Trilogy. He directed his first film, Play Misty for Me, in 1973. And then he directed his first Western, High Plains Drifter, in 1973. And High Plains Drifter is also a revisionist Western. It's the movie that Richard Harris was watching when Eastwood called him. And Eastwood would go on to make, he made a lot of Westerns, including The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1976 and Pale Rider in 1985. So Unforgiven was Eastwood's 16th film as a director, and he swore it would be his last Western. It was not. But despite its dark thematic content, we've all seen the movie and we all know how dark it is. But despite that, Unforgiven became really one of the greatest critical and commercial successes of Eastwood's career. It won the Oscar for Best Picture that year, and Eastwood won the Oscar for Best Director. And in addition, Gene Hackman won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for his portrayal of the Sheriff Little Bill. So Eastwood is now 94 years old, and he has made 43 movies, and he is still directing. And in fact, he just released another movie like a month ago, Juror Number 2, which, many people think just because of his age will probably be the last film he makes. But it's a very good picture, and I recommend that movie to you. So he is still making movies at the age of 94, which is incredibly impressive. So here's some further viewing if you enjoyed Unforgiven and you want to see more revisionist anti-Westerns. High Plains Drifter from 1973 and The Outlaw Josie Wales from 1976 are two more Westerns directed by and starring Eastwood. And they are revisionist Westerns. They're not as kind of relentlessly dark as Unforgiven. And then we talked about the Dollars trilogy. That's 3 films made by Sergio Leone. And if you want to see what a spaghetti Western is, watch those movies. They're incredibly fun movies. And once you see them, you'll see how much Tarantino has taken from those movies. He's very, very influenced by them. McCabe and Mrs. Miller is a really good revisionist Western by Robert Altman from 1971. It stars Warren Beatty, and it also kind of deflates the myth of the moral West, and it's a really good picture. And I put in Tarantino's 2 Westerns because they are revisionist Westerns, and they are heavily influenced by, as we said, the Dollars trilogy. Django Unchained, and this is a great example of the anti-Western because the protagonist in this movie is African American, which would have been unheard of during the classic Western period. And then The Hateful Eight, which came out in 2015, is particularly interesting when you contrast it with Stagecoach, because it is also a movie about people put together on a stagecoach and what happens to them together. Highly recommend that movie. So our next movie, sorry, I have to check the date. It's, the holidays are coming up, so we're not going to talk about our next movie until January 14th. And that film is Scarface. Directed by Howard Hawks in 1932. And Scarface is the quintessential gangster movie from the genre's heyday in the 1930s. It's a great picture. It stars Paul Muni as a character loosely based on the real-life Chicago mobster Al Capone. And it was one of the first and most successful gangster movies. And I think it really holds up even today. So please watch that, watch Scarface, and join us here on January 14th, and we'll have a discussion about that movie, the gangster genre in general, and that movie specifically. So now I will take your questions. So I'm looking at the questions here. Let's see. Certain modern Hollywood stars, such as The Rock, are said to have clauses written into their acting contracts stating that the movie is not allowed to make their character look bad, lose a fight on screen, take a significant beating, etc. In contrast to this, Unforgiven puts Eastwood, a man's man, Hollywood star, in numerous humiliating situations throughout the film. Do you think this willingness to look bad on the screen for the sake of the story is something modern Hollywood actors are losing? I absolutely do. We have to remember that at this point in his career, Eastwood had portrayed a lot of perfect heroes who never lost fights and were never hurt. When he made this film, he was, I think, 60 years old. So, he had a lot of films under his belt. And so I think at that point in his career, he was not afraid to show vulnerability. And it's obviously an important part of the character in this story. But I totally agree that modern Hollywood actors are losing something by appearing perfect, because I think audiences appreciate a character being in danger if there are stakes, if it's really possible that something could go wrong, the character could be hurt or the character could die. It's something I love about the Indiana Jones movies. Harrison Ford's portrayal of Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones is very vulnerable and gets hit and cut and knocked out, and he wins some fights and loses others, and it just makes for a more interesting picture. You don't know what's going to happen to the character, whereas if you see a movie with The Rock or a Marvel movie or whatever, those people are superheroes. They have superpowers, and they do this and a car explodes, and it's just completely uninteresting to me. Obviously, the vast majority of people don't feel that way because those films are incredibly popular. But I think there's really something to be said about having a vulnerable, why can I not say that word? Hero, so that there are actual stakes, in the movie. So I'm really sorry. I'm trying to scroll the questions, and I cannot do that. For some reason, my mouse has disappeared. So I'm just wondering if Lucian, can you text me the questions? Because the chat is frozen and my mouse has disappeared. Let me see if you can text me the questions. And if not, we'll just call it a day, and we'll talk about the next film. This, I could read half of the question, which says Eastwood spaghetti westerns in the 60s could be regarded as revisionist westerns in comparison to the classic John Wayne movies of the 30s and the 40s. And that is absolutely true. The character Eastwood plays, the man with no name, is indeed morally ambiguous. Oh, hey, are we?
Hey, yeah, I thought I would just come on and we can talk through these together.
Okay, great. I'm so sorry. I can't. No,
it's fine. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. So give me a question.
So the question, and this was one I put in, but the question I had about that specifically is that you have the 30s and 40s westerns, right? And then you have the spaghetti western that are kind of turning those on their head, and then you have this of the deconstructionist approach. So with that in mind, and with taking into consideration that this is a series about genre, I was just wondering if you thought that is like what you think about, is there a limit to how many times an established genre can be reinvented? And then do you think some genres are more conducive to reinvention than others?
Yeah, so I do. I mean, like we have sort of just been discussing, Unforgiven is just a complete, turnaround of every sort of convention of the Western. And it's kind of like once you've broken, it's kind of analogous to atonal music. Like once you sort of throw out all the rules, you've broken all the rules, you've followed the rules and then you've broken all the rules. So what do you do after that? And I'm not sure. And I think it might be one of the reasons that Westerns don't really get made anymore. And the ones that do tend to be remakes of previously successful Westerns. Tarantino has made two Westerns, but they are very respectful of the spaghetti Western template. And I think, but as I was saying earlier, I think the Western as a genre is particularly appropriate to dismantle because it was so specific and so, so morally clear cut. I think it was very easy to make more interesting films that had a little moral ambiguity in them and shades of gray rather than black and white. And you even see that, this movie was made in the 90s. The Dollars trilogy was made in the 60s. But even in the 1950s, late 50s, early 60s, you start to see revision in the Western genre and films like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which is a John Ford film. And that is a film specifically about legends being false, and the legends of the West not being true. And that whole movie is about the man who shot Liberty Valance is not the man that everybody thinks shot Liberty Valance. And through the course of the movie, you discover who did. I just, the Western was ripe for dismantlement, but I feel like it's pretty much been done, and another sort of big reversal was in the classic Western, Native Americans are the villains, they're the bad guys who are trying to harm white people. And so you get a lot of films from the 70s on where they become the protagonists, they become the heroes. And, the first one I can think of is there's a movie called Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman from 1971. That's a movie about a white man is the protagonist, but he is adopted by an Indian tribe and essentially becomes
portrayed positively.
And you have the same trope in Dances with Wolves, which was won the Oscar for Best Picture. And in that movie, Kevin Costner basically becomes part of a Native American tribe, and that whole movie is showing the sort of Western expansion from the point of view of Native Americans. So, and then in Django, the protagonist is African American. There's definitely been a lot of switching out the white male protagonist. I guess we haven't really had yet a Western with, total female protagonist hero that
like a Nightingale or something. It's not an American.
Yeah. And so maybe somebody should do that, that seems like a good idea to me. But the Western is, I think it's, as a genre, it's kind of played out because it had its heyday and then it had its revision. And I'm not sure how much more you can do with it.
I was going to ask of where you think it stands today. Do you think Django or Hateful Eight was probably the last really big mainstream one?
Yeah, and now lately it's just kind of people remake good Westerns. So they remade, there's a really good movie called 3:10 to Yuma from the 1950s. And that was remade, I don't know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But the remakes are very respectful of the earlier pictures. They just kind of have better production values, and I don't really know what the value is in just remaking something that is already good, But I would also say, there are also kind of Westerns that aren't set in the American West in the 1890s, and I think of a movie like Hell or High Water, Taylor Sheridan movie, which takes place in the present, but it's about a bunch of guys in the West robbing banks, to save their home. And, just sort of morally, story-wise, it feels very much like a classic Western.
Like No Country for Old Men or something.
Exactly. Or, Taylor Sheridan, who made Hell or High Water, directs the TV show Yellowstone, which is one of the most popular shows in America. And, that's a Western.
Yeah, that's a huge modern iteration of the Western that's very popular right now.
Well, it's still happening. And there are spinoffs of that show that are, all Westerns. And so there's still a place for it. But I don't know. It's definitely a genre that has been, played out. And you could also say, something like Star Wars is basically a Western in space,
Sure.
So I think that's sort of probably the future of the genre more, like to take stories that have that morality, but not set them in America in the 1880s, One more question, or
Yeah, I'll give you one more before we go here. So John Wayne was like quoted, the star of our last movie, Stagecoach. John Wayne was quoted as really hating Eastwood's spaghetti westerns in the 60s, right? That he did not like the violence. He didn't like how it was kind of turning the core tenets of his era of movies on their head. I was wondering, and I don't know if he was ever quoted on this directly, but I was wondering what you think he would how he would feel about Unforgiven, considering that it's kind of becoming an anti-violence thing
right.
again now. That
I think I think he would totally hate it.
he would still hate it. Yeah.
Not because of the violence, but because of what he would see as the immorality of it. Just the fact that there is no good guy. The good guy becomes a terrible person at the end of the movie, and I think that was one of his biggest beefs with revisionist westerns, was that all of the pictures he made, there was a good guy and a bad guy, and he always played the good guy, and I think a lot of older directors who grew up in the earlier, very clear-cut, very moral Hollywood kind of lost their way once the rating system was invented in 1968, and you could have much more explicit violence and sex in movies, and you could talk about things that they were never allowed to talk about. They really found themselves at sea. And if you see, like, Billy Wilder, who directed Double Indemnity, is my favorite director, and he is a very sophisticated, his movies are very adult and have very kind of sophisticated takes on sex, and but nothing is ever stated explicitly. And once he was able to state things explicitly, he just completely loses his way. It's like he doesn't know how to express himself without hiding what he is attempting to express, And I think the same thing would apply to Wayne. And I'm trying to think, I think the last movie Wayne made was True Grit in 1970, or he made one after that. Rooster Cogburn, I think, is the last movie he made, but in 1970 or 1971, and True Grit is a revisionist Western, but he is the hero and he is the good guy, and I think that's what disturbed him, was that, and of course this is all taking place in the 1960s, when the morality of America is just changing generally, and so I think for older people, the World War II generation people, I think they just saw a complete breakdown of society. And the fact that you had a Western with no good guy, was just, an example of the total collapse of American society in their eyes, So I think John Wayne would hate this movie,
I would love to watch it with him to see his reaction.
He would be incensed. Yeah. So there you go. So was I right about that date, January 17th?
Yes. So I was going to say that we will see you guys again on January 14th. Same time, same place for Scarface. The old version, not the 80s version.
Oh yeah, I should have pointed that out. The movie was remade by Brian De Palma in the 80s with Al Pacino. That's not the one we're talking about. We're talking about the 1932 movie directed by Howard Hawks. So that's it. Thanks. Have a great holiday, everybody. Happy New Year. And we'll see you next year.
Take care, everyone.